Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for coming back and joining us on our series of these town halls with our legal experts. My name is Bilal Khan, and today's topic is legal traps regarding protesting. And it's my honor to introduce our two special guests today. We have Jinan Chehade, graduated from Georgetown University Law Center with experience in civil litigation and advocacy. Jinan worked at the Department of Justice, Civil Rights, and while attending Georgetown Law, Jinan has represented refugees seeking asylum through the Center for Applied Legal Studies. And at the Muslim Legal Fund of America, Jinan serves as the Civil Litigation Junior Staff Attorney. So welcome, Jinan. And for those of us that were here in the other session, we're here with Christy Jump again. She brings more than 25 years of litigation experience. Her practice involves civil constitutional cases, including challenges to the no-fly list and other government watch lists, religious discrimination in employment and accommodation in institutions. And Christy serves as the Civil Litigation Department Head at the Muslim Legal Fund of America. So welcome, Christy, and welcome, Jinan.
Thank you so much for having us. Yes.
Thank you. So we are going to be tag teaming a bit today. We'll be speaking about legal traps regarding protesting and things that are unusual that you may not be aware of across the board because they only apply in particular states. So Jinan is going to get us started out, and then I will jump in later.
Yes. Awesome. Do you mind going to the next slide really quick? Okay, awesome. Hello, everyone. Again, I hope you're enjoying this series that MLFA is putting on, which is especially needed and useful now. Again, it's really important that in this time we're moving with shared knowledge, right? Of we know our history, but also how can we share this knowledge between lawyers and students so that when they engage in activism, they can do so effectively and legally as well. So at last count, as we know, especially in the last month alone, there's been just under 100 college campuses across the U.S. that have had students protesting, right? Or have had encampments or that are usually like pro-Palestinian students as well. So students in general, and why this is so important, they usually have a long-held tradition, an American tradition of exercising free speech. And the demonstrations by college students in particular on social justice issue is an American tradition and are usually on the front lines of these different movements. So if you've been attending this series, you know that we've talked about Title VI protections, free speech, how it applies to students in our college campuses. But today we're going to be talking about most locally, right? What is going on locally in each state, things to keep on an eye on. Because again, laws differ from state to state. So what might be legal in one state may not be as relevant or legal in another state. So we're not going to be discussing like federally what's universal and legal, but instead really getting into the nitty gritty of things for each state and things to watch out for so you don't fall into these traps again. Something that me and my friends always like to joke about, like make sure you know the law before it knows you, because we don't want the law to know you. So I know students, there's a lot of anxiety around this. So we just want to make sure everyone knows the law to kind of minimize this anxiety and move forward with this shared knowledge. All right, next slide, please. Okay, awesome. So again, really quick overview of the nationwide concepts when it comes to free speech. You guys have probably heard this over 100 times, but a quick recap couldn't hurt. So you know this like the back of your hand. But as you know, we have a constitutional right to free speech without government interference. So when you talk about free speech, the first two things that should come to mind is first, the First Amendment, right? That Congress shall not make no law abridging freedom of speech or press or the right of people to peacefully assemble. So that includes, again, speech, press, and assembly, which is protest. And then the 14th Amendment, which states that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. So more so applies to states as well. Next slide, please. All right. So something to point out, and I think is kind of confusing for students, is that there's a difference between how these amendments apply to government and private actors. So the Constitution actually protects free speech from punishment by the government, not by private parties. The Constitution does not protect speakers from backlash or criticism. So again, we've seen in the headlines recently in the past couple of months of people being fired from their jobs over their pro-Palestinian comments, a law firm rescinding an NYU student job after Israeli-Hamas comments, even my own job being rescinded as well. Those are all private actors, right? So the First Amendment doesn't necessarily apply to that because this isn't, again, punishment by the government. This is by private institutions and parties. But again, to note that some states, such as California, New York, DC, and so on, prevent private discrimination based on political affiliation or lawful political activities outside of work, which is actually greater protection than what federal law applies. So just because this doesn't apply to private actors does not mean that you don't have any protection whatsoever. Okay, next slide. Again, we're almost done. This is just a quick overview for those who forgot. But public forum. So public forum is a place that traditionally has been held out for general use by the public and speech-related purposes. So this could be parks, streets, sidewalks. Like think of where you go to protest. Those are usually public forums. And at public forums, the government cannot regulate any content. So what does that mean, content? I can't say what, like, you're allowed to, you can protest for this specific movement or this cause, but not the other. That's all content-related speech. Again, the nuances are very much more difficult, but that's just more of an overview. But they can, what the government can do in public spaces is restrict time, place, and manner that is appropriate and upheld. So for example, they can tell you, you have to be on this street or not on the other street. You can't come at, let's say, 1 a.m. or midnight. Those are all time, place, and manner restrictions, which are allowed in public forums. So again, this is all federal regulation of freedom of speech. Next slide. All right. So lastly, with this quick overview, I'm not sure what happened to the picture there, but so let's say you go to a private university again. So as we discussed, all these amendments and laws federally, they usually apply to public institutions. That includes public schools and public universities. So what if you go to a private institute, right? And that's not it's not regulated by, let's say, the First Amendment. So what protections do you have? You actually have quite a few protections. Chances are that your institution still accepts some federal money, and that means that they're subject to Title VI, and that you may have some of those same protections as well. But the school's actions won't be considered state actions under the First Amendment. So what does this mean? What does Title VI mean? Again, really quickly, it applies to private institutions, and it protects students in programs that receive federal assistance. It protects them from being discriminated against or harassed based on their race, color, national origin, or other shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics. And then again, there are some state laws that may help you, depending on where your school is located. For example, if your school is located in Massachusetts, Massachusetts actually has the Massachusetts Civil Rights Act, which is a state law that prohibits interference in civil rights and actually applies federal law to private actors. So applies federal law to state and private actors alike. So it's actually much more broader than the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1871. So this is something just to keep in mind, that even if you go to a private institute, there might be policies in your school that might help you. Your school might accept federal funding, so Title VI applies. Or again, the state itself might have protections that apply federal laws and regulations to that state and private institutions. So really quick overview before we get into the nitty-gritty of each local law, so you know kind of the umbrella issue of what we're dealing with, and then we can get to the laws. But with that, I'll hand it off to Christy to get us started on the specific states.
Thanks so much. So we'll start with Ohio, and the portion there that actually is just a little bit hard to read at the top of the bullets, that just gives you the name of the state law. So we can make that available to anybody who would like it. But basically, Ohio has some specific provisions that make it a felony to commit a crime with 2 or more people while wearing white caps masks or other disguises. Obviously, that was a statute that was originally geared more toward trying to prevent Klan rallies, but not necessarily naming it specifically that. So masks or other disguises is something that more recently we have seen some jurisdictions point to if students are protesting with keffiyehs covering their face or with other face coverings beyond simply wearing a mask like we all wore during COVID. It's got to be something more than that in order for there to be some pushback or to say that it's something that is actually disguising. So that could be considered a trespass, a misdemeanor that would then elevate it up to a felony if you're doing a misdemeanor like a trespass, something that is typically considered a lesser crime, that would elevate it up by having any kind of disguise that would prevent you from being identified while doing it. The next one is that there were additional penalties added to existing laws, but with new harsher penalties for critical infrastructure, for protests near critical infrastructure. So there are heightened penalties if a protest or demonstration is to occur near oil and gas pipelines or near other infrastructure. You would then be considered a criminal trespass and criminal mischief, which would have higher fines. It'd be a first-degree misdemeanor, can be up to 6 months in jail, and punishable by a $1,000 fine. And even more so if it's deemed to be something that is tampering with the facility or with the critical infrastructure, that could then lead to up to a third-degree felony and up to 10 years in prison and a $20,000 fine. So knowing what knowingly and improperly tampering, again, would also get you up to the third-degree felony point of view. So if we could go to the next slide, that'd be great. All right. So we're going to talk about Texas, which is where we are located. And in Texas, the good news first is that back in 2019, Texas lawmakers passed a law that established all common outdoor areas at public universities and private universities to be treated like traditional federal law applies to public forums, allowing anyone, not just students or university members, to exercise free speech rights there, as long as their activities are lawful and as long as those activities do not disrupt the normal functions of the campus. So that's a 2019 statute that was signed into law. We do have some other commentary and materials on that that are already on our website as well. So feel free to look at our materials on the landing page if you want to see any of that reference as well in a little bit more detail on this law. So I said that was the good news, but then it got a little more complicated. In March of 2024, Governor Greg Abbott, who was the governor at the time that the law that we just referenced in 2019 was passed, put in place an executive order that adopts a specific definition of anti-Semitism and requires schools to make plans to limit free speech. And the executive order literally says in it, we support free speech, but which is one of the I think most telling parts about the executive order. We support free speech, especially on campuses, but, and then here are the limits. Now that executive order also specifically calls out two student groups in particular, Palestine Solidarity Committee and Students for Justice in Palestine, and requires that all campuses in Texas come up with a plan to discipline students, specifically students from these groups, that violate what this new executive order calls. And now this was put in place in March of 2024 and gives campuses 90 days to come up with a plan and to basically turn in their new homework to the state of Texas, explaining how they're going to discipline these students. It can be up to and including expulsion, and basically contradicting the spirit and the main concept of the 2019 law. And then it got worse. So then you can see that not long ago, there's a headline here that's on the screen. There's criticism and praise of the Texas governor for sending in state troopers to break up a protest at University of Texas that also happened at UTD, which is University of Texas in Dallas. State troopers were sent in. The protests were widely reported as being peaceful. However, there were many arrests of both students and of professors, and a lot of footage that got around, and a lot of what appears, at least at first glance, to be disproportionate reactions. In recent days, we will say that CARE filed a lawsuit challenging the executive order as unconstitutional, particularly because it does single out two student groups, and those two student groups both have the same shared heritage. Now, it doesn't mean that students who do the protesting or who would be covered by the constitutional challenge to that law necessarily have to be Palestinian or even Muslim, but they could be allies, they could be just associated with, they could be someone who is affiliated with or acting on behalf of that particular shared heritage. So if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, Florida has some specific provisions as well. One of Florida's laws has new penalties. Again, some of these laws were changed to just increase the penalties, but not necessarily change the law, but just raise up the penalties. So one of the laws in Florida, there's new penalties for protesting near gas and oil pipelines, much like we saw on the previous slide, or 2 slides back, and making it a felony offense for trespassing in those areas. This could cover some protests that are near pipelines and infrastructure, even if there's not damage that occurs to the infrastructure, and even if tampering or damaging is not part of the protest or even necessarily the goal. So the way that it's worded is that could be impacted broadly. Then on the next one, also still within Florida, the definition of riot is expanded to be broader and to include protesters. Also raises the punishment up to a 3rd-degree felony and includes any group of 3 or more individuals with a shared intent to engage in what Florida will determine to be disorderly and violent conduct that might result in an immediate or imminent danger or property damage, personal injury, or actual damage or injury to others. So be aware for that. Be ready to look at that. If you're in Florida, just understand that it's a good idea to know where the pipelines are, even if you can't see them, and where any critical infrastructure may be. The definition of that is still not necessarily tested or defined, but it might include particular junction boxes, power boxes that cover a wide area. So those are some things to be aware of as well. Now, if we go to the next slide. And now we're on to California. So these are ones that have been introduced and are being considered. These are not ones that are in effect currently, but California State Assembly member Kate Sanchez introduced a new bill that would impose new penalties on protesters who obstruct highways during protests that would affect emergency vehicles. Doesn't mean that there have to be emergency vehicles on those highways at that time, but if those are highways that emergency vehicles generally use, and if there are protests or demonstrations that obstruct those highways, then this proposed bill would address those. And this was meant to double the penalties for protesters who intentionally block the flow of traffic on highways, which could prevent emergency vehicles from responding to emergency situations. And again, this doesn't require that there actually be an emergency situation, and another emergency situation, but could be that just simply that it blocks a path to a particular main hospital, or that others, that emergency vehicles may need to or have in the past used those highways. The other proposal here is that San Francisco's District Attorney, Brooke Jenkins, mentioned considering charging pro-Palestinian protesters with felonies for blocking the Golden Gate Bridge. And that would be referenced under an existing law that applies in San Francisco, which is Marcy's Law, where victims may seek restitution against violators. That would require victims, so those who were blocked, or in the words of the San Francisco DA, unlawfully imprisoned or falsely imprisoned because they couldn't go anywhere once the highway was shut down. Might be, so basically anybody in a vehicle that was stuck on the highway at the time, or on the Golden Gate Bridge at the time, is somebody who, under Marcy's Law in California, could seek restitution against the protesters themselves. Now, the comment here was that this is an active and open investigation. Anyone who was falsely imprisoned on the Golden Gate Bridge is urged to contact California Highway Patrol. So if we could go to the next slide. Okay, and we're going to switch now to Illinois. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to Jinan, who will take over at this stage regarding Illinois.
Thanks, Christy. Yes, so Illinois. I live in Illinois, so this is kind of my home court. But Illinois, I think, is something that's important to understand. One of the most common Illinois statutes and Chicago ordinances cause that most of the arrests in Illinois are disorderly conduct with bans against unreasonable disturbing of others and provoking a breach of the peace. So what Illinois considers like disorderly conduct and a breach of the peace is a little more expansive. So some examples are blocking traffic, disturbing a government hearing, making noise in a residential neighborhood, and the list goes on. But those are like the main few that would result in this. So an interesting thing about Illinois that's not applicable to other states is that an Illinois statute and a Chicago ordinance prohibits resisting arrest, as we know, but resisting arrest can also be just going limb. So as we all know, like any type of movement could be resisting arrest, but if you go limb, Illinois just does consider that resisting arrest and can result in greater charges as well. The Chicago Disorderly Conduct Ordinance also prohibits failure to obey lawful police order to disperse. So if you're in the immediate vicinity of 3 or more people that are committing a disorderly conduct and you refuse to leave, you could also be charged with that same unlawful conduct as well. But there's also one Illinois court that uphold the application of this ordinance provision to a bystander who refused to disperse from the scene of a riot. So keep in mind that even if you're not directly participating in this disorderly conduct, being in the area could also give you those same risks as well. And the last thing would just be for Illinois is check your school's policy. And this is especially for University of Chicago. Again, University of Chicago recently, the protesters called to remove the pro-Palestinian encampment were removed after a brutal police raid. The University of Chicago actually has heightened policies that make it clear that any protests cannot jeopardize public safety, disrupt the university's operations, or involve in the general destruction of property. And in order for police to disperse this encampment or make arrests, it doesn't have to be through Chicago Police Department. They actually have their own police as well. So anytime you're engaging with protests on campus, make sure to check the school policies because some are more heightened than others, as we see with the University of Chicago. And then I'll pass it back to you, Christy, for Washington, D.C.
Okay, thanks. And so for Washington, D.C., there are some special provisions. These are a little more, these are pretty interesting for me as to how they came about. So beginning in 2002, there had been some issues beforehand in Washington, D.C., but in 2002 in particular, there were protests for Occupy Wall Street, anti-globalization protests that led to $22 million in damages that came up. And for the fact that protesters had been hogtied, they had been held in handcuffs and in zip ties for long times after having been arrested and being brought to a jail. And there were just a mass roundup, and the police had just declared the entire thing, or the authorities who were there had declared the entire thing to be disorderly conduct and shut it all down. So what happened after that then is that they turned that into, after much evaluation, much self-study and reflection, then the Metro Police changed the laws, and they changed it in the First Amendment Rights and Police Practices Act of 2004, listing that it would now prohibit use of tear gas or pepper spray on peaceful protesters, would prohibit the use of zip ties and hog tying people after arrest, and also that police must wear identifying badges and give protesters warning. And I'm sorry for I think this is appearing a little bit of doubled up, but we'll get that corrected before we post this on our website as well. But I'll let you know the information that's here is that police must wear identifying badges, give protesters warnings and a way out and a way to exit before the police come in to break it up. And that way out needs to be something other than just going straight through the police line. So they have to have a peaceful exit. And then after 2 weeks of protests happening, then what happened is that they had, with the encampments that were happening most recently, they went on for 2 weeks. DC Metro did not go in and break it up immediately. And then just happened to be the day before before there was scheduled congressional testimony regarding why DC had not broken up the mass encampment that was happening. The Metro went in and broke it up the day beforehand. And they cited to safety and sanitation concerns as the reason that they did that. And said it put out a statement that they were going to be complying with this 2004 law, the First Amendment Rights and Police Practices Act of 2004. You can see the picture. The picture here is a partial glimpse of some of what happened and of the police who were there. So they are at least clearly labeled and in compliance with those revisions that took place. So if we could go on to the next Washington, D.C. slide, that'd be great. Okay, so here, there is one more slide that is, or one more picture that is there. I'm not sure. We're having a little bit of a translation among the different, I think, the different devices here where the pictures aren't all showing. But we will get that up in the future for you. The additional picture after the equals sign is just the cover sheet of that 2004 law that we just discussed. So basically, the things that happened led to and equaled changes. And so also in DC, if you remember Lafayette Square and what had happened there before, at the time, President Trump walked over to one of the churches and had a photo op with the Bible. There was disbursement of protesters that also were listed as being primarily peaceful. The Department of Justice reached a settlement with the Department of Interior's U.S. Park Police in 2022. And that settlement required many of the same things that even the Park Police now must abide by a lot of the same things that Metro Police agreed to abide by. They must wear fully visible badges and nameplates on all of their outerwear, and even if it is riot gear. There must be guidance and training on how to use non-lethal force. There must be clear dispersal warnings before there's any action taken. So a lot of the people who were present that day said that one of the problems that they had was that they never heard a warning. The Park Police said that they had issued warnings, and those who were present in the square that day said we never heard any warnings. And then also some unlawful conduct occurring does not give a blanket right across the board to use force or declare unlawful assembly as to everyone and break it up more aggressively than would otherwise be justified. So there has to be more training, more of an evaluation. And one of the things that was missing in what happened at Lafayette Square was just communication among the different law enforcement arms. There had not been much communication there. And we do have one more state that we want to cover. We cited Indiana unintentionally, so we're going to skip back to Indiana now. There we go. Thank you for that. And cover Indiana because we didn't want to leave Indiana out. And Indiana also put in place some new penalties for protests that take place near critical infrastructure. This is one of the trends that we're definitely seeing. Creates the offenses of criminal infrastructure facility trespass, which is a new one, and critical infrastructure facility mischief. And so protesters had been banned from Indiana University by the Indiana University Police Department. They were prohibited from setting foot on campus for 1 year. This also could be applied to professors the way that it's written. The Indiana legislature passed a bill that would allow for docking pay from professors who express personal views in class time. The ACLU didn't like that much and filed a lawsuit against Indiana University for violating the First Amendment rights of the plaintiffs in seeking the 1 year ban from campus simply for exercising First Amendment rights and for political protests on campus. So those are things that, again, as the headline that's here makes clear or gives you an example of, you can see students lined up and they're linking arms, and then right through that you can see the riot gear of the police not too far away. So those are some other examples there. And then if you don't mind, if we could go back to right after the second Washington slide. Okay. So to move forward with our shared knowledge, again, as we began, we want to come back and close up the same way that we started. There's certainly some good and some bad regarding specific states' laws. Recent reports do indicate that 97% of protests have been peaceful. 97% of campus protests have been peaceful in recent months. And that study was put out by The Guardian, and that went through, I believe, the end of April right up to the very beginning of May. So we do recommend just that even with them being primarily peaceful, which may not match the news coverage that they're necessarily receiving, just make sure that you know the laws of where you are. Make sure that you know that your specific areas laws, your specific jurisdictions laws. Also know what has happened in the past. For other demonstrations, we've got some other presentations we've done through this town hall format, and some other information that we have on our website that go through tracking how certain universities, certain campuses have handled protests over the past decades, and if there's any variation, what that variation may be, and what led to it, or what we suspect may have led to it, and also just what the numbers are. Is this something where more action kicks in with greater numbers, or not necessarily? What we're seeing is not necessarily. It's not just the volume of protesters. Be sure to listen carefully for changes that take place in your jurisdiction, where you are, on your campus, in your city, and within your state. Chances are that if there are some changes, they're probably going to be broadcast and announced pretty loudly by those who are quite proud of them, much like some of the examples that we ran through for individual legislators who had put forth or proposed stricter penalties for a lot of protesters and for the types of things that protesters were finding themselves arrested for. Be sure that you listen for those updates, even if they're proposed. Make sure that you know what the proposed change is, because it's possible that you need to be prepared, without much warning, for that to actually go into effect. And then make sure that you stay on the right side of the law. Make sure that you stay legal. And within your protest, just make sure that you are following the law. You're not giving someone a reason to focus on anything other than the topic that you're trying to convey, the point that you really want to make. You're there to make a point and to convey, what you're protesting about, to get people to listen to the substance. And so you lose some of that when you have something that breaks the law. That doesn't mean that everyone who's arrested did anything wrong. Those are things that are going to make their way through the courts to determine. So we're certainly not saying that, but we are saying do your best to make sure that you are informed, that your actions, if you do happen to end up getting arrested or getting detained, you can defend them, and you can explain that they are legal and they are consistent with what has been accepted and allowed in the past. And so then if we could go to the next slide. We do want to point out that this is an entire team effort. Every time that we come on here and do a town hall, every time that we represent one of our clients or any number of our clients, the entire team is behind it. So we have our pictures of our civil litigation department here, team members. The entire team has to help out. The entire team contributes, even if you only happen to see one or two of us more visibly. So thanks to the entire team for making it possible for us to put things together.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Jinan. And thank you for sharing the depth of the team that is there behind the scenes, constantly fighting and defending the rights of Muslims in America. A couple of questions, if you don't mind. The first question being, we saw that the Harvard case that we filed was with the Department of Education instead of going another route. What can the Department of Education really do?
Yes, so we did file a discrimination complaint under Title VI with the Department of Education, and the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights has enforcement authority over any university, any college campus, whether private or public, that accepts any federal money. So they have that authority over over the universities, the colleges, and to make sure that they are compliant with the anti-discrimination provisions. We went the route that we did, first of all, because some of the students are not necessarily looking for more spotlight. Some of them have gotten far more of a spotlight than they ever intended, than they ever asked for. They didn't necessarily all attach their names to anything or go in public places, and yet they were, absolutely blasted on campus, or they've had people chasing them down. And we wanted to give them the protections of the confidentiality that the Department of Education process provides through the Office of Civil Rights. That's why we have not publicized which students we represent. We won't confirm which ones we do or do not. We know who they are. Department of Education, to an extent, knows who they are. And to an extent, Harvard knows who they are for the facts that are described. But the complaint itself is confidential. The students' identities are absolutely confidential. And another key factor with a Department of Education complaint through the Office of Civil Rights is once it decides to open an investigation. So we file a complaint that doesn't guarantee that there's an investigation opened. But once the Department of Education decides to open a complaint, and they did with our Harvard complaint within a matter of days, which we were very pleased to see. Once they do that, then they can take faster action than a lawsuit would be able to provide. So it can give faster protections, it can give faster remedies than the deliberate process, speed of the legal process often gives people and allows. And by doing that, we can get protections for these students a little faster. And if nothing else, they get anti-retaliation protection more quickly while this continues to be investigated. And, Harvard is aware, the Harvard administrators are aware of the complaint. It's actively being investigated. The Department of Education can and has asked for materials and asked for Harvard to answer its questions and provide things. And we don't necessarily see that, but we know that it's happening, and we're grateful to the investigators for getting on that so quickly, which is great.
Thank you. Thank you for the detailed response. The next question we have is, what are remedies if campuses are treating students protesting for Palestine differently than they treat other protesters?
And so for that one, certainly we can speak to that. I think when we give Jinan a chance to speak, if she has anything she wants to say on that, and then I'll just come in and add some thoughts of my own as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think obviously first it depends on if this is a private or public institution, and just like fact-specific investigations as well of how they were treated differently in what context as well. And that's kind of where the Title VI protections come in, of were they discriminated based on their race, national origin, religion? Did they receive federal funding in any way? So going back to remember our initial slides of, again, the First Amendment doesn't necessarily apply to private institutions, but Title VI may apply. And if it is a public institution, that's where First Amendment freedom of speech ideas come in as well. So again, very broad overview, but I'll pass it on to Christy for the specifics.
Which is exactly right. I agree with everything that she said. I will add as well that if there is inconsistent treatment, if there's something where people believe that they can show that, for example, protests were allowed for other nationalities, other races, other events, other types of organizations, and then when these students come out and protest, they're treated differently, then they can show that inconsistent treatment, that disparate treatment, and that can give rise to certainly a Title VI complaint, which shows that there's a difference there and that these students are not being kept safe on the campus, which is an obligation that the colleges and universities have. And also, it potentially could give rise to local claims under the city rules, the city restrictions, the state laws or state human rights acts. There could be something where there might be an action that's appropriate against the city-state actors who come in. And so those law enforcement individuals maybe, or even the college administrators who initiate that, who call in the police and say that we want you to come in and to do this, and they didn't do it before. So those are discriminatory actions that can be brought under a variety of statutes, including state, but also some federal statutes that will aim to enforce consistent treatment. If you're going to draw a line, you can draw a line. There are some schools that have more strict rules than others, particularly those that are in big cities where it's not just a pure campus environment. Will have more strict restrictions or more stringent restrictions, and that's okay as long as they're applied to all groups that protest.
And speaking of law enforcement and authorities, would you be able to shed some light on different law enforcement groups that arrive on campus, and which of these groups have jurisdiction on campus?
The first line of jurisdiction certainly would be the campus police. Those are the ones who absolutely do typically have, they're the first level of defense, so to speak. They are the first level of enforcement. They are the first ones to come onto campus. They're the ones who presumably know the campus and know the rules and the restrictions and everything better. And in an ideal world, the students interact with them, and the students are familiar with them and know who they are, who to go to if they need protection. Not necessarily that these individuals would be coming after them. So that would be the first line. Certainly, as long as there's a memorandum of understanding among law enforcement agencies, then others can come in, and it can be done at the request of a chancellor. A university personnel may make a request to a municipality or even to the state to send in other law enforcement officers who may be for neighboring towns, or they may be for the town where the campus is located, or they may be, as we saw in the example with Texas, state troopers that are sent in. So that typically is done by way of agreement of the different law enforcement agencies and the different governing officials at the same time. We also see sometimes, though, and there are some positive examples as well, which is that, for example, I believe it was San Francisco State University that I think it was the administrator, actually not that one. There was another one, San Francisco State University, we talked about in a different presentation, where they really worked well. Their school president worked really well to listen to the students and to hear them, which is not something that has come up in many of our examples today. But to hear what the students' concerns were instead of looking for ways to trip them up or to find violations. But there are some schools, and there was one in particular that I believe is in California, where the school administrator had called in additional forces and wanted additional law enforcement officers to come onto campus and to potentially break up what was happening, the lawful protest. And the city official, the city mayor, said, no, you're not doing that here. That's not going to happen in my city. So you can do whatever you want with your campus police, but you don't get to call in others if I don't approve, and I'm not going to approve. I'm not going to sign off on that. So that also can serve as checks and balances as well.
Yeah, and just a caveat off that, I think Christy explained it very particularly, but also when it comes to that kind of communication between the city officials and the campus police, just know that sometimes even when the mayor refuses or the city official refuses, campus police might themselves come and either clear whatever is happening, whether it be the protest or anything. That's what happened at the University of Chicago when the mayor actually refused to send in the police. That was actually campus security that they themselves were the ones to come into the students and clear what was happening.
Thank you. And a big thank you, Jinan. A big thank you to you, Christy, for taking all the time, and Christy for visiting us twice and sharing these stories and these insights. And thank you for sharing the advice to stay peaceful, to understand the rules, to read your student handbook, to understand if there are changes in the rules, and continue to be aware of your surroundings and continue to protest in a safe manner. And to all of our guests and supporters that are joining, thank you so much for joining us throughout this week. For those of us that are watching this on YouTube and other media platforms, please spread the word to different student groups, to parents, to supporters, so they can benefit from this knowledge and they can benefit from these tips. And as always, the Muslim Legal Fund of America, we're here upholding and establishing justice in our courtrooms and our communities, and continuing to leverage the deep bench of lawyers to bring these insights, to bring these tips. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and please continue to support through your voice. Please continue to support through your donations as well. And thank you again for taking the time to join. And we will see you next time.